director of UC Center Sacramento. One of the things that the University of California takes pride in, and a central part of its mission, is not just excellence in undergraduate education and brilliance in research, but also the preparation of graduate students as future researchers and policymakers. And so for that reason, several years ago, we initiated a program called the Emerging Scholars Program, which recognizes every year one or more outstanding graduate students in the University of California system. And here to introduce this year's winner is one of our very own graduate students, Ross Butters.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ross Butters, as Richard said. I'm a teaching assistant here at the UC Center Sacramento, and I've been with the center for several years, and I love it, so I keep coming back, and I've a lot of familiar faces from when I check people in at the front. But our mission at UCCS is to educate California's future leaders in politics and policymaking, as well as to make expertise from scholars in the UC system available to decision makers in the Capitol. And today, I have the pleasure of introducing one of our UCCS emerging scholars, Jacob Kirksey, which will come up in just a second. But the award for emerging scholars recognizes excellence in graduate student research with a direct impact on public policy. And Jacob is a PhD candidate in the Gewurz Graduate School of Education at UCSB and a graduate research fellow with the NSF. His research examines unintended consequences in educational policy and focuses on frequently forgotten populations. The research that he's presenting today examines how recent immigration enforcement operations are related to absenteeism in school. And as you join me in welcoming Jacob Kirksey, I'm going to give him a nice little certificate here for a photo op. So please welcome Jacob Kirksey.
Thank you very much. Okay. Good. All right, that was a nice little segue, right? Like, totally great. Hi, everyone. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here to talk about a topic that I think is not only relevant in policy, in practice, but also just to be here and talk to you all and speak for a different audience. You know, a lot of the time, you know, academics and researchers, all we talk to are our own office walls or other academics who are interested in what we do. So it's always exciting to have this opportunity. So my today's topic, I chose not just because, again, it's policy relevant, but also it's very illustrative of my dedication to work with specific school districts. I had the opportunity to speak with some of the students who are interning here at the center, and I sort of urged to them that a lot of the malleable policy factors and the decisions that affect schools happen at the district level. So I think you'll see that, you know, that is exactly this type of implications I'll be talking about today when we talk about the topic of immigration enforcement in education. So one of the recurring themes that you'll see today in my research is I am considering not just the direct effects of immigration enforcement measured by deportations, arrests, media headlines, not just on immigrants or children of immigrants, but thinking about this issue much more broadly and how this might be impacting students who are U.S. citizens or children of legal residents in the United States. You know, it's not uncommon these days that we get a push notification as we wake up on our lunch break or after we're coming home from work, something to do with deportations that are occurring, the Office of Immigration and Customs Enforcement's change in policies or their implementation of deportations, otherwise known as ICE. Or just this last weekend, a lot of the rhetoric surrounding will there be increase in raids happening and where would they be and those sort of fear-mongering tactics. But regardless, you know, the influence of immigration enforcement, the topic, is very pervasive and is impacting not just immigrants and children of immigrants, but you can imagine a lot of different populations in addition to those individuals. So to add a bit more than just sort of a media coverage of immigration enforcement, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the policy context and how this differs in where we are now and where we were back in the Obama administration. So in the Obama administration, we saw some different priorities than we currently see under the current presidential administration. We did see a rapid increase in deportations under Obama from the previous administrations. He got the nickname Deporter-in-Chief for this reason. But most of these deportations were occurring in the branch of ICE known as Homeland Security Investigations. And this is a specific branch that targets removals of individuals who are part of organized crime or who have been convicted of a felony. And Obama also issued the first memo to what we know and has long been a guideline of ICE, which is a sensitive locations guideline. This is the policy that you may have heard about, or it's not a policy, actually, I should be clear. It's nowhere in law, which means it can be not used as a guideline. But it's the guideline that sort of says ICE agents won't come on to school grounds, or they won't show up to churches or demonstrations. And Obama sent a memo to schools sort of emphasizing that this was the guideline that was governing the ICE agency at the time. Also under the Obama administration, there was a focus on people not just with DUIs or these sort of minor convictions, but people with felony convictions. And again, sort of talking about this increase in deportations that first occurred under the Obama administration, really in the last part of the second Bush administration, we saw a rapid increase in funding for ICE. Now, how this has changed a little bit today, starting under the current administration, we saw that there was an increase in deportations, but specifically under the enforcement and removals operation. So overall, we've seen a decline in deportations from the first term of the Obama administration and the current presidential administration. But we've saw an increase under this specific branch, and the enforcement and removal operations has a much sort of broader jurisdiction. This is the agency that is removing individuals who may have gotten a DUI and their fingerprints were scanned up, and ICE got a hold of them from the FBI and issued a detainer, right? So a much more broad, interior-focused agency under ICE. So you've got HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, ERO, and then the third one is Border Patrol, and that's obviously their jurisdiction is on the border. Under the Trump administration, Trump also renewed what's called Secure Communities Program. This is a county-by-county program where counties essentially currently, before Secure Communities, would upload fingerprints and the FBI would have access to those fingerprints. Secure Communities also makes it to where those fingerprints go directly to ICE as well, and ICE then has the authority to issue a detainer on an individual. So again, this could be anybody with a minor conviction or just happens to have their fingerprints scanned because they were detained or arrested by a local agency. Also, as you've seen in the headlines, there have been parents and even 18-year-old kids who have been arrested on their way to or from school. So we can see that under the current administration, there is a bit less focus on people with criminal convictions, though it should be noted that these people still make up a majority of people who are removed just by nature of how ICE sort of comes in contact with them. As I said before, there have been media reports of ICE coming onto school grounds, and in fact, in Tennessee this last January, started the policy of schools actually have to cooperate with ICE, which currently in California that's not the case. In many school districts that's not the case. But teachers or administrators could lose their job now in Tennessee based on this new guideline. And obviously, we've seen a harsh increase in the rhetoric towards immigrants, coming from just this last weekend as a really good example, but also the media coverage has just been substantial over the last few years. But what's interesting in considering this, right, is it's in all of our lives, and it's in the lives of kids, students who are attending schools. It's in the lives of teachers, of administrators. This photo is from a protest that happened right after the current administration was elected and came into office in January, taken at Bret Harte Middle School in Oakland. And this protest was reaffirming the notion that Oakland Unified and this school is a place for immigrant children to receive an education, their legal right to an education. And so we see that the influence, whether a positive or negative influence of immigration enforcement, is certainly influencing the way schools are operating and the kids in schools are conceiving of their education. I put together, or actually my colleague Chris Azuna at UCSB put together this map from some data that we collected in looking at these different school districts and where they fall in proximity to deportations that are occurring. A lot of the time we think about deportations as occurring in the border states or in the Northeast and Northwest. But as you can see here, each dot represents a school district that's within 100 miles of where a deportation has occurred between 2009 and 2016. The darker dots show school districts who are within 25 miles, so right in the proximity of where deportations are occurring between these years. And so very clearly from this, you can see that deportations are occurring across the country, and there are thousands of school districts that are within this proximity and could conceivably be affected by any effects from immigration enforcement. Now, I'm not the only researcher who's interested in the effects of immigration enforcement on students or children of immigrants or children of non-immigrants. But oftentimes researchers sort of cite this triangle constructed by Joanna Dreby in some of her ethnographic work, talking about how when we think about immigration enforcement, there's sort of this hierarchy of effects. There's the direct effects of families being dissolved as a result of deportations. But then this triangle stretches all the way down to Latino families and who have authorizations to reside in the United States, but their students may not know their legal status, or this conversation isn't happening within this family. Or recently, as you can imagine, if you're Latino in the United States and you hear this type of rhetoric, because it's mostly targeted towards Mexican immigrants, this might, disproportionately impact your perceptions and how you live your everyday life as well. But in my research, I don't disagree with the hierarchy, but I definitely think when we're talking about schools and children and communities, a better way to think about it might be thinking about this as a ripple effect. So a deportation happens and begins the ripple, and the effects of it spill over into different populations. So what I'll be talking about today is how a deportation or a raid can impact individuals in schools based on having a peer with a family who has been confronted by ICE, or friends or peers, these types of conversations that we know can affect school climate or community climates. And so some of the questions that motivates my research is, how far does this ripple or this triangle extend? To whom is being affected, right? And once we know who is being affected, how are they being affected? Because in education, you can look at test scores, you can look at absenteeism, you can look at socio-emotional skills. But part of our job as researchers and as policymakers is to understand exactly how people are being affected in order to appropriately respond and dedicate the necessary resources. And so once we decipher this and determine what ways they're being impacted, this then promotes our actions as policymakers and educators to combat potential negative externalities from immigration enforcement. Now, popular media picked up on one of the ways in which immigration enforcement could be impacting students in schools, and this way was through students simply not showing up. So in Las Cruces, New Mexico, back in February 2017, there were a series of raids that the school district later reported caused 2,000 students to just not show up to school in the following weeks. Now, if there is a relationship, a consistent relationship between immigration enforcement, deportations and arrests, and impacts on absenteeism, this is a huge policy problem. Because absences, both in education and in policy, are of the utmost importance and have gotten a lot of attention in recent years. Thinking about it from an education perspective, we know that when students aren't in school, they aren't receiving that instructional time, that opportunity to learn, that opportunity to be with peers. And as a result, this leads to a lot of other educational consequences that we often hear about in policy dialogue. So absences cause declines in test scores, declines in GPA, declines in likelihood of high school graduation. And so it deserves our attention as an education community or as educational stakeholders if we want our kids to succeed in these various metrics we've outlined. And in a policy view, we know that absenteeism is particularly important because we've been funding schools and districts through daily attendance for a long time. In California, every day a student attends school, a school district gets about $29. So if a student or a student body is missing a lot of school, the school districts aren't receiving the same funding that they could be receiving if there was full attendance. Additionally, current Senator Kamala Harris, former Attorney General in California, spearheaded the In-School On Track program, part of her legacy as Attorney General, that refocused school district efforts on having data systems talk to each other, respond to themes that have come out from the data of students missing school or students who are truant, and have created and in fact influenced a lot of the current attendance policy in California today. And then at the national level, and relevant to California as well, the Every Student Succeeds Act allowed all states to choose a few accountability indicators, one of which was chronic absenteeism, to be held accountable for and measure school quality and success within the state. So California is one of 37 states that has adopted chronic absenteeism, defined as missing about 10% or more of the school year, as an accountability indicator for them. And so this sort of intersection between a policy-relevant hot topic like immigration enforcement and an education policy-relevant topic is the motivation that underlines the study I'm going to talk to you about today. So in this study, I asked the basic question, does the number of incidents of immigration arrests, so raids, any person being arrested with topical importance to immigration enforcement, link to absenteeism in secondary grades? And then this gets at the who. What types of students are being impacted most by this series of immigration enforcement? So again, the data I'm going to show you are from a specific school district that I've worked with for several years, and we got motivated to look at this just given the nature of the school district and how it's situated in a really rich and diverse community that has been disproportionately impacted by immigration enforcement. So the city where the school district resides is fairly small, but it's still an urban city, so 100 to 150,000 people live in the city. The city is over 70% Latino composition. The city also has 30% of its overall employment lying in agriculture. And the reason that's important for the current topic is that we know in California about 1.5 million people in the agricultural industry are undocumented immigrants. So we suspect that there are quite a few undocumented families that are within this city. Now, how this school district looks in terms of the years that I'm examining, where immigration enforcement raids were occurring and how this related to student outcomes. Between 2013 and 2017, over 70% of students were considered to be from low socioeconomic background. So this is measured whether by family income or family employment factors, basic census information. Additionally, the district is slightly below average on the accountability metrics. So this includes rates of high school graduation, academic performance of students, absenteeism, discipline, etc. And then the last thing I'll say about this district that is a bit unique, at least from someone who's coming from Texas, where all the districts were really integrated together from elementary to high school. This secondary school district, so a high school district, which is the site of this study, is separate from the elementary and middle school district that is educating the rest of the students in the city. This district looks fairly similar to other California school districts. So the demographics are a majority of Latino students, followed by white, Asian, other race, and black students. It has a pretty high proportion of students who are designated English learners, or for students whose second language is English. Additionally, its disability population is about reflective of the national average. About 10% of the students have a disability. One of the unique aspects of this district, though, is it educates a fairly high proportion of students who have migrant status. Now, migrant status has nothing to do with immigration status. Migrant status is based on a student's parent's job occupation that typically follows the weather or the climate in some way, so fishing or agriculture, things like that. And then some of the data I have also is based on transcript data. So, the average GPA in the district was 2.79, just some of the basic fairly typical achievement and GPA that you would see across California. I'm going to look at absenteeism in two ways, and I'll tell you why. So first, I have really rich absenteeism data. So imagine I have every day that a student is in school and every period that they missed or didn't miss. So this is a really rich source of information, especially to be able to track things that are time sensitive, like an immigration raid. And so for this district, students are required to attend 7 class periods a day. So the average number of absences was about 75 across the whole year for your average student, which is about 10 full days of school, which is fairly typical. Now, of policy importance, I'm also looking at the effects of chronic absenteeism, which is a particular threshold. As I mentioned earlier, chronic absenteeism in California is defined as missing 10% or more of the school year, or about 18 days. So the other thing to note about this in terms of how I define it for this data is also on par with California. So students had to be enrolled for 30 days or more, and after sort of accounting for that, about 15% of the district students were considered chronically absent, slightly above what you'd expect nationally, but on par with other California schools. So one of the things that's interesting about this, and perhaps why there's such limited research on the effects of immigration enforcement in schools, is because there's a lot of data problems when it comes to measuring immigration enforcement. ICE does not provide their data. It's aggregated to sort of their 20 sites, major flagship sites across the country. So this really isn't helpful. Limited data is published even from that. So I couldn't even find this last year's yearbook that they put out. So it's not really conducive to the type of analyses that should be done, the rigorous sort of quantitative analyses that can actually parse out some of these effects on students. There has been some success with FOIA requests or Freedom of Information Act requests over time. So I have some work looking at that that's put together actually by TRAC. It's a center at Syracuse that does a lot of this FOIA request for researchers. But this study is different because it's limited to one school district in one city. I actually collected information from local media sources to document the number of incidents and when they occurred, both from the English and Spanish newspapers that were primarily the newspapers that served the city. And so what I did from this is, constructed a variable for when the incidents occurred, how many incidents occurred, and log the information on how these incidents varied by arrest and things like that. So this allows us to dig into some of the mechanisms behind, the impact of an immigration raid of just, a handful of individuals, or, as we've heard in California, mass ICE raids that have occurred in areas like LA County. Now, what's important about this is that this study is not just descriptively looking at absences. And by that I mean, I'm not just looking at absences before and after an immigration raid occurs. I'm interested in eliciting a bit more cause and effect type relationship between how immigration enforcement or an arrest relates to student absenteeism. So to do that, we have to control for a lot of different things, because if I just looked at pre and post absences, I'm not accounting for absences that change over time. So for example, we know that things like ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, is changing the trends in absenteeism over time. Districts may have different trends over time, and so you're not accounting for these time trends that are providing some bias in your data. Additionally, we know that students have their own household or demographic characteristics that are also influencing absenteeism. And so we want to be able to control for these different things, not just by having in our models, the race or ethnicity of a student, their family's income, or things like that. We want to control for it in a bit more complex ways as well. We also want to control for school characteristics, so engagement within administrators, the size, your peers, and also month and day of the week. As you can imagine, students miss Mondays and Fridays disproportionately more than they do the rest of the week. They also miss days surrounding holidays, right? Or professional development days where you have minimal classroom instructions or half days. So we want to be able to control for some of these things as well, because a lot of the time, ICE raids will happen right before a weekend. And so we want to be able to parse out that effect as well. And I won't say too much more on the modeling, but if you're interested, you were able to control for these various things using OLS regression and various levels of fixed effects. And that's all I'll say. But that doesn't mean, with this advanced statistical analyses, that descriptive statistics and graphs and beautiful things like that also aren't informative. And so this is a graph I put together looking at just a very tight period of time from September to October 2015. The dots over here on the left represent days connected to Labor Day weekend, because as you can see, the absence data is pretty noisy. That's the blue line in school level rates of absenteeism. And you can see it spikes up a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, kids, families want a 4-day weekend or a 5-day weekend, right? They'll leverage that. And so it's natural you're going to see a spike in absenteeism around those sort of days around holidays. Same thing is true over, the winter holidays and Thanksgiving break. But then the orange lines represent raids or incidents of arrests that have occurred in the city of the school district. And as you can see, most of them actually occur when the dip in absenteeism is fairly low. But that's the day that it was occurring, not the day it was reported. So very clearly, as you see during this time period right now, I didn't want to put it on the graph because I wanted to keep this fairly clean, but this was heavy media reporting of this particular incident, which was the largest raid that occurred during the time that I'm examining. And so naturally, you're going to see spikes and dips based on this media reporting. And you can even see as a couple raids occur even more, this leads to, correlates to a fairly large spike in absences. And in fact, if you look at where absences were at one time point, where they went, those gaps are largest following a raid, not just these professional development days over here or the days connected to Labor Day weekend. Now, to sort of add some color to this, I'll show you the results from the statistical models that control for these various levels of confounding variables in the data. So this is going to be the effect of a singular incident, not controlling for how many individuals, though as you can imagine, that goes in the direction that you would expect. So just controlling for time, so year to year, we found that one incident led to 2 additional absences for the average student and a 5 percentage point increase in the likelihood of chronic absenteeism for that student. Then when you add school controls, you see it dips just slightly, but is still a statistically significant effect. You add controls for the students over time, so essentially students are serving as their own control, so pre and post an incident. And month and day controls, so controlling for Friday, the influence of being in school on a Friday or missing school on a Friday or a Monday. And you can see that across all of these 4 specifications, the number tends to be around 2 absences or 2 periods that have been missed by students on average due to these raids, and an increase in the likelihood of chronic absenteeism by 4%. This may not sound like a lot, but then when you aggregate it up across the years and across the student body for this district, you're talking about ICE raids alone, controlling for everything else, resulting in 50,000 or more days missed by students over the 4 years, and a 27% net increase in chronic absenteeism. That's not to say that the district's chronic absenteeism went from 15% to like 42%. Is that the correct math? That's to say that over the 4 years, you divide 27 by 4, that's the average rate of the district that went up in chronic absenteeism due to ICE raids. Now, the second research question, and perhaps the policy relevant topic here, is which students were being most impacted by immigration enforcement raids? I first looked at the migrant status, free and reduced lunch status, Latino versus non-Latino students, white versus non-white students, English learners versus non-English learners, students with disabilities, students without, and students who had ever been suspended. So first, we saw that students of migrant status had a much higher rate of absences missed due to ICE raids than students without migrant status. Students on free and reduced price lunch missed more days due to raids compared to students without free and reduced lunch. Latino students missed more. Non-white students missed more. English learners missed more. Students with disabilities missed more. And students who had ever been suspended missed more. This is a long way of me saying that this is actually going in the direction that you would expect a mechanism related to immigration enforcement to go. Meaning that Latino students in this very rich, ethnically rich demographic of district are being disproportionately impacted by these immigration raids compared to, for example, their white student counterparts. So thinking about this again in terms of policy relevance and cost, the main effects, so just the average effect across the district, each ICE incident related to 1.75 cuts on average. This is mostly in form of unexcused absences of students, which translates to 350,000 cuts caused by ICE activity over the 4 years, or 50,000 entire days missed. Then let's look at what this means just in terms of attendance funding. This isn't accounting for additional resources needed for remediation or catching students up in schools or outreach to families, just attendance funding. California pays $29 every day a student attends school. So at the high school level, 350,000 class periods equals 50,000 days, which means that ICE rates over the 4 years resulted in $1.5 million lost in attendance funding for the school district. Again, controlling for everything else and just based on attendance funding from the state. And so if you break this down by ICE rate, one incident that resulted in an arrest on average cost the district $53,000 just in attendance funding. So now I'd like to talk about what this research means for a variety of audience. First, I'll speak a little bit to my people. So us researchers, I think it's important for us to further refine our measure of immigration enforcement. It's a very complex phenomenon, right? And if you are measuring this in the wrong way, if you're just taking national, right, aggregated statistics and trying to associate them with some sort of, causal relationship in education, you're not going to get an accurate effect, right? Like whatever effect could be correlated with a variety of other things. And so I think this measure was good, not only in, I think it works, both mechanism-wise, it fits in with our theory, but it also matches a lot of the other work that I've done with the more specific data points and the more accurate measures from the FOIA requests. And it actually validates perhaps the only consistent finding with the effect of immigration enforcement in schools. So there's a lot of prior research that's looked at the effect on standardized achievement, on high school dropout. The only consistent effect that research has found to date with regards to education is students are missing more school because of immigration enforcement. And so one of my colleagues actually, I love her, and she responded to this research in just the perfect way. Jacob, why you've done this? You've documented this effect, right? Like you're sort of adding to the consistency within a research. But now focus on what you can be doing or what schools can be doing. And so where I'm interested in going next is looking at how are schools and school leaders specifically responding to heightened immigration enforcement, or how are teachers responding to their students, or how are teachers feeling in terms of their job satisfaction when this different source of stress is likely entering their classroom, particularly if they have diverse students in a diverse community. For policymakers, just in the absenteeism world, this topic is of the utmost importance if we are going to hold schools accountable for chronic absenteeism. Because you can imagine the schools that are having kids become more absent because of immigration enforcement are also the schools that perhaps need the most support. So when thinking about attendance funding, thinking about how we are going to hold these schools accountable, it's important for us to view absenteeism not as this overarching umbrella, all-encompassing policy, but how we can start to help other specific instances where they are being penalized from this broad policy in terms of absenteeism and truancy. And so when thinking about, the broader school climate, the broader community climate, I think it's important for us to sort of assess the broader policy climate of absenteeism. So in general, absenteeism policy, and this isn't just true in California, it's true across the country, absences and truancy are addressed in often very punitive measures. So if you are designated as a truant in California, there are specific procedures that you have to go through, a student attendance review board, or various letters that get sent out to your families, and you could eventually wind up at the DA's office, right? So there are real implications if we, again, are going to use this absence measure to hold students in schools accountable. And so it's important for us to take a step back, think about, are there malleable ways or areas where we can insert some discretion for how policies are impacting students when it's not exactly their fault that they're not showing up for school. And so when you think about policies and you think about consequences, one of the ways I like to sort of default to, especially at a policy level and as a researcher level for certain, when I'm not in schools all the time, is to start to ask educators and start to think about how this topic and the policy relevance is actually entering schools and in other educators' minds. Because as these educators or the practitioners are starting to identify these different stakeholders or the different sources of support in their communities, from teachers to add support for students that are missing school for reasons they're not sure of, adding additional resources from school leadership, or inserting nonprofit organizations, particularly those dedicated to informing individuals of their rights to an education or rights for immigrants in this country. And in the case of this school district particularly, engaging city government and having city government, which has, prior to this research, really focused, or not focused at all, on the effects of immigration enforcement, but is starting to have that dialogue. And schools can be a huge change agent. And so, again, the second research question and the finding about who is being impacted by immigration enforcement, this can also add into some of the implications for where we can start dedicating some of the resources that we put into schools to respond, right? So a lot of the time, researchers will say, okay, we need to, especially in absenteeism, we need to get kids to come to school. That needs to be our priority. I think this adds color to that context and saying, okay, this is not a context where your response should be come to school. It's a bit different. And so understanding who's being impacted will help you further refine the areas where we should be supporting students who are most vulnerable. And then finally, I think researchers, policymakers, and educators have one big thing in common in terms of implications, which is, what is the theory of change? What are your next steps for action given an implication or a finding such as this? And so after this finding, presenting this, talking about it with this school district, the humbling aspect to it was simply to go in and say, what is your response? How would you respond to this type of finding? And the district administrator that I work most closely with is actually using this as sort of part of his larger sort of effort to promote support for an ethnic studies class for this particular district. So I've gotten to know this district quite well over the years, and one of the things that I've seen or I've heard is a big struggle is students' ethnic identities. So students talking about, what's their country of origin, how does being, having parents who, are from Mexico, relate to the fact that you were born in the United States, and how do you sort of wrestle with that identity? And these are a lot of the mechanisms that play into exactly what we're talking about. When a newspaper headline is talking about this massive raid and some of the reasons for this raid, or when all of the national media outlets are advertising this potential, 2,000 people being deported this weekend, we have to think about some of these mechanisms and how schools might be a huge part in providing us direction in where to take this, both in terms of policy and research. So thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak with you all. This research is particularly important to me. It's one of the most interesting parts of what I do, and a privilege to really do it from a position as a researcher. But I have to acknowledge my dissertation committee, because this is a chapter of my dissertation. So Michael Gottfried, Hunter Gelbach, Carolyn Satin-Bajaj, and Tina Sloan. And then also the National Science Foundation, as they have covered a majority of my time in graduate school. That's allowed me the opportunity to do cool research like this.
Okay.